Hey everybody, welcome to Digital Frontlines. This is where, we really are passionate about delivering technology to our warfighters out in around the world, but primarily out in the Pacific and Indo-PACOM, and really deterring the PRC, the People's Republic of China, and their goal to kind of become the number one superpower. And so I think it's important that we talk about technology, we talk about leadership. We talk about academia, authors, of some great books out there that have people have written about technology. And as we think about digital transformation and Secretary Hegseth's vision for change and President Trump's vision for change, we really have to transform the DoD and our government, but specifically the DoD, to just move a lot faster, right? And so if you think about like Silicon Valley, what happened, how did Silicon Valley, first start, right? So it was back in 1956 that William Shockley co-invented the transistor, right? And so after that, he was kind of a toxic guy, wasn't really a great leader, but the treacherous eight, which were these employees of Shockley's employees, they created a company called Fairchild Semiconductor, which ended up kind of spawning into Intel Corporation later on, right? And so the Minuteman rocket, and after World War II and the Cold War, is really where we saw this technology boom in Silicon Valley, and all of these startups, started popping up. And Stanford University was really kind of the pioneer there, where they wanted to incentivize students to stay locally around Mountain View, California, and start companies. And after in the Cold War, the DoD started infusing these companies to build technology, and that was the technological boom of Silicon Valley. But unfortunately, from 1956 until 2025, right? All these decades later, we have moved away from Silicon Valley, and not only that, we've created a tremendous amount of bureaucracy within the DoD. All these processes of how we write requirements, how we fund our requirements and fund our programs, how we manage and lead with this command and control hierarchical structure of our military, how we build technology, how we write our code and our software. Everything that we do is like back in the Stone Age. It's back in 1956. I can give you so many examples of my experience working in the government, in the military. One example was where I had a government official that instructed a prime contractor to test their software per the DID, which is a requirement of 1968, and this was in 2020. Right, I had to go and get that person feedback, say, no, that's not what we're going to do, get the colonel involved to change that. But the bureaucracy is there, and it's entrenched in our day of life. There's actually a great book by Michael Pillsbury called The 100-Year Marathon, where he talks about he worked at the agency at the CIA for several decades as an advisor to U.S. presidents, all the way back to Nixon. And in his book, 100-Year Marathon, he talks about this book that he passed. Their field operators will go to a country, and if they want to disrupt that country and create absolute bureaucracy, there's a book on how to do that. And unfortunately, we probably learned from our own mistakes on creating that bureaucracy. So, anyways, I want to talk with you a little bit about some of my greatest books, my favorite books that I think that everybody in the Department of Defense should read, specifically if you're working inside the halls of the Pentagon, or if you're a congressional staffer on the Hill, or in the Senate. I think all these books are great books. So I'll get through them one at a time. But first off, I wanted to just touch on General Hyten yesterday was at the Space Symposium. Space Symposium is a big conference in Colorado Springs at the Broadmoor Hotel every year, and it's one of the biggest space conferences in the world. Everybody, our international partners there, NASA, the U.S. military, we're all there. And he gave an interview with Space News, and he talked a little bit about what it was like for him in the in the military. So he was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the vice commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, representing the Air Force at the time, as in charge of U.S. Air Force Space Command. And so General Hyten talked about really the threat around the world. So what are the Chinese and the Russians doing over the past 10 years? I really looked at the last 10-year period, and the Chinese have just put up a tremendous amount of capabilities up in space, right? And so have the Russians. And unfortunately for the U.S. military, we have not kept up with the rate of capability delivery like our peer competitors have. And it's due to, this bureaucracy that we've created over the last, 50 to 60 years. Okay. So, he talks about how we need to change the way that we fund our programs. He talks about, our satellites that we put in space. We need to move away from these large platforms, these, $500 million satellite constellations and platforms that we put up in space. And we need to move towards these kind of pizza box size satellites that are a lot cheaper, similar to like Starlink. He talks about the proliferation of space and the architecture and investing in the networks and making them a lot stronger. So I think it's really important to kind of learn from General Hyten and General Raymond and General Saltzman and what they're saying. Right, we have to move a lot faster. These guys know, they've been in the Space Force for their entire career since they got out of the academy, and so we have to move a lot faster. So with that said, I want to talk about my favorite books, and I think if we all start reading these books and we get really fluent in them and learn about the lessons learned, I think that'll help. I've been running a book club in the U.S. Space Force for the better part of 4 or 5 years now. And I've got a pretty good turnout. We get colonels, material leaders, senior material leaders, portfolio executive officers, contractors, CETA support contractors, system engineers, and technical advisors, FFRDC, so like MITRE and Aerospace and MIT and Johns Hopkins, and even our prime contractors from Boeing and Lockheed and Raytheon and Northrop and all the big boys. But got a pretty good turnout, and I've got them all reading these books. And typically, I get them all read these books, and then the next year they leave, and I get a new batch of officers and customers and leaders, and we read them again. But so first off, I want to talk about Turn the Ship Around. Turn the Ship Around is a great book, and it is about a retired submarine captain named David Marquette. And he had this ship called the Santa Fe, the USS Santa Fe. And essentially what he learned, and he revolutionized leadership and really intent leadership, right? You can Google the little video, 9-minute video, if you just Google Turn the Ship Around. Great little animation video. Highly recommend it. And I'll put it in the link here so you guys can have that. But he essentially talked about how when he got onto the Santa Fe, it was a new ship, and it wasn't that analog ship, it was a digital ship, and he had to get the ship ready for sea really quickly. Like typically, they take a good year or even longer to go to sea trials and get a ship ready before they go out on their deployment around the globe, especially a nuclear submarine where they might stay underwater for a long period of time. So there's a lot of training. He didn't have that much time. He had to move fast. And what he found out was that he didn't need to be that command and control leader anymore, right? Because he was going out to sea, and he said, hey, he started barking orders right in the bridge, and everybody looks at him, and he's like, they don't operate that way. And so one of the sailors said, sir, just tell us where you want to go. What do you want to do? And he goes, well, I intend to submerge the ship. And then everybody said, batten down the hatches, all men are accounted for, all oxygen is levels are right, missile tubes are loaded correctly. Like, they went through their whole checklist, and he didn't have to bark orders and tell everybody to do that. They responded with what they were going to do, and it was like a beautiful orchestra of just all the way down that checklist. So it's a great book about intent leadership and really trusting your people, setting your vision, removing your blockers, and being there to support them if they need it, and then get out of their way, right? Get out of their way and let your people do the work. So I think that's a fundamental transformation that we need to do in the military, is just trust the people that actually do all the work down on the ground floor, in the basement, in the halls of those submarines, or in the halls of Pentagon, or those software developers at those software factories, right? Trusting them. Another great book is Chip War by Chris Miller. Chip War really talks about the need for the U.S. government, the United States of America, to really start manufacturing computer chips in the United States and not be dependent upon countries like Taiwan and some of the manufacturing companies in Taiwan. Right, we have to learn how to make these chips, and it's a challenge because Taiwan, I think 90% of the world's chips are made there in just a couple of companies, and it's because of their ability to do precision level manufacturing. And so we're going to have to really adopt that technology. But the book Chip War, it's a great book about learning about kind of the global implications with China, with the PRC and Taiwan, and it really comes down to chips. All the wars that we have, it's about money and dollars, and this one's about computer chips. The next book I want to talk about is Seat at the Table by Mark Schwartz. Mark works up here in Seattle at Amazon, really great thought leader, and he really talks about the role of the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, and the future of that, and how companies have to transform to really deliver value and be on these like cross-functional teams. But Mark in his book really just talks about how the leadership team, everybody has to be a seat at the table. We can't optimize for our own benefit. So if we think about in the U.S. military, we have a material leader, which is typically a lieutenant colonel. We'll have a program manager over at like a Lockheed or a Boeing, right? That's the prime contractor. We'll have a CETA support, which is your system engineer. You'll have a aerospace or FFRDC leader. You might have a government civilian like a GS 14 or 15, right? And so there'd be like 5 or 6 people there. Then you've got like your head of architecture, you got cyber, you got the software development, you've got the requirements people in charge of test and training and getting the system working, the operators that use the system, right? And so we have to start thinking about everybody being at the seat at the table, right? Having everybody have a voice so that the colonel is not saying, hey, I got all the money and I'm in charge, right? And you guys got to do what I could do. We can't operate that anymore. That colonel cannot understand everything about the system. We have to trust our people. And so when we prioritize our backlogs, we have to make sure that the right people are at the seat at the table, making the informed decisions on which item we work on next, right? And help ensuring that the highest value is at the top of our backlog, not just from a user or warfighter perspective, but from an architecture or internal system perspective, to make sure that we're investing internally in the system to ensure that it's reliable, ensure that it's lethal. And so that's a really great book, Seat at the Table. The next one, great book, really passionate about this one. This is The Phoenix Project. Put it up here on the screen. The Phoenix Project is by Gene Kim. And I'll tell you a fun little story about the Phoenix Project. I helped start a startup years ago when there was just like 7 of us, and it was about DevOps startup, specifically a tool called Jenkins. And so in that startup, we had about $30 million, and the guy that invested the money, he showed up to our office with a stack of books in his arm, right? And he says, nobody can write any more code. Don't talk to customers. Don't answer the phones. You guys have to read this book. And we sat there on beanbag chairs in an office with some of the smartest people in Silicon Valley, and read this book for a couple of weeks, went through every chapter, and we studied it. And the Phoenix Project, a great book. It's a replication of a book called The Goal by Eli Goldratt from the 70s. But the Phoenix Project's a fictional book that's like the rise of the ashes of a program that's failing, that's not doing really well, and some really great lessons learned on how to do DevOps the right way and help the business win, or in our case, the military, help the military win. So a great book there. The next book is called Accelerate by Dr. Nicole Forstrand. She wrote this book along with Gene Kim and Jez Humble. Jez Humble and Gene Kim are considered to be some of the godfathers of DevOps, and Nicole Forstrand is really her book and her work on DORA metrics, DevOps research assessment, and The Accelerate book's a great book to take some kind of good nuggets about how to accelerate technology, specifically around like Dora metrics, right? So things like looking at your total cycle time, right? And so improving your total cycle time of delivering value, like concept to cash, right? Also, mean time to failure delivery. So, like when a system crashes, how long does it take to get that system up, or how long does it take to resolve a production defect, right? I actually like to take the Dora metrics out of the book Accelerate. I'll take that and I'll put that into the contract language so that I can incentivize my prime contractors and help make sure that they're practicing continuous improvement and good DevOps and having some good metrics in place to do that. Another book's called Lean Software Development by Mary and Tom Poppendieck. They really talk about waste and being lean. We think about waste. They talk about the 7 forms of waste. And I know for Secretary Hegseth out there and folks at the Pentagon, we kind of have this WOW. I love WOW, right? War on waste. But there's 7 wastes, right? There's extra features or extra work, right? Or if it's hardware, it's extra inventory sitting on the shelf. We have task switching. Right, so that's why we need to manage our WIP limits or our work in process limits and only work on X amount of features or work at one time. There's defects. That's why we have continuous integration, test-driven development, pair programming, mob programming, peer reviews, continuous integration. So defects is an area to really get after. Then there's rework and relearning. And also handoffs and delays. And so that goes into my next book, Value Stream Mapping by Karen Martin, which really value stream maps out all of the process, so the entire system, and you can learn about all the handoffs and delays, because those are the 2 forms of waste where we can actually address the most and get the most amount of efficiency. So if you're at Doge, I'm sure you guys are really helping out in this area, but waste is where, handoffs and delays. So looking at wait times, right? Like Marina Nintz was on a podcast earlier talking about where when she does value stream mapping and she, you might have like a data set and then that gets finished and then it goes to the next person or the next organization and the data is required a different type of data set, right? And the fields aren't matching up, right? But if there was a cross-functional team and they were working together and you eliminated that handoff, you wouldn't have that waste there, right? And so thinking about, that types of waste. The next book I want to talk about is Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton. Matthew Skelton, great book. I think Matt is the co-author there. But those guys talk about like architecture and how teams are organized. And I love reading his book because he talks about like he'll go into an organization if it's all cubicles, right? And then he'll look at their architecture, their software architecture, or their mission architecture. It's very similar to the cubicle design. If they're not talking to each other, then the architecture will look like that, and the architecture won't talk to each other. But if they're collaborative, right? If they're working in these small teams, right? The architecture might look a lot better. It might have 12-factor and containerization and API first and microservices, and they might be organized around a team and have front end, middle layer, and back end all in that architecture, right? Flow, because that team's kind of working on that piece. So that's a really great book. Team Topologies. The next book I want to talk about is Lean Startup by Eric Ries. He wrote this book, and this is great for like government organizations where you guys are small and you don't have like a lot of the big process, a lot of the big requirements. I think we can move fast, right? And so if you can just read this book and think about talking to your users, your customers, doing like a proof of concept or a hypothesis or a pilot project, setting the right metrics and to validate your hypothesis, right? Lean Startup really talks about that. Developing your vision, understanding your personas, understanding who you're building it for, and then having more of a collaborative approach to it. So, all your startup companies, obviously you're reading this book, but I think in the DoD, we could read Lean Startup as well. I had an AFRL program, Air Force Research Laboratories, where we had the Lean Startup on everybody's desk. All the developers were required to use it. So big shout out to Dr. Emily Bonner out there. I want you to come join the podcast one of these days. She's a big fan of the Lean Startup. Measure What Matters by John Doerr. John Doerr cornered the market on OKRs, so objectives and key results. So fun little story. When Sergey Brin and Larry Page were still working out of their garage in 1999, I think John Doerr had some VC money, and he had, I think, $11.9 million to give to Sergey and Larry. But he said, the only way I'm going to give you this money is if you use OKRs, objectives and key results. And so what it is it's a quarterly goal setting approach, right? So you set your objective, then you set your 3 key results or 5 key results. The key results need to be binary, aspirational, and then they're measurable, right? And you can validate them. And then they're cascading. So at the highest level, they can set their goals at Google, right? And then, like YouTube wants to be the, get like, 1 billion, views this year, right? And then they set that goal, and then each of the verticals down below, the CEO or the leadership, they set their quarterly goals, and it just keeps everybody aligned. There's a great football analogy there of like you got your head coach, he wants to win the Super Bowl. Offensive coordinator, then he sets his goal, right? He has to get 300 yards per game, right? He has to stop the blitz, 75, 80% of the time, right? And passing completion by 80%. Now you got the lineman coach. He has to stop the rush, 90% of the time. So it's cascading goals all the way down to the individual player, person on the team or developer, right? So everybody understand their goals. The next book, Team of Teams by General McChrystal, really great book about how General McChrystal in 2004 really revolutionized special forces, the Special Operations Command. He found that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was more efficient than our special forces, our SEALs and our Green Berets. The Al-Qaeda was able to plan out, and they're going to be in their caves, or they go out and deploy these suicide missions, right? They come back, they'd have a retrospective, they learn about it, right? They were very efficient. And what General McChrystal realized is that he had to really change the ball game with our special forces community. So he created, transparency, where he always took calls on speakerphone. Every week he'd have all the special operators around the world be on a call. So you could be a Navy SEAL out in the Philippines, and you're going to hear about a Green Beret in Afghanistan and what type of technique they're using, what type of intel they got, right? So very transparent, open collaboration, and really trusting your people. I had a program recently that I was helping to transform to build, the ability to do test and training in space. And we had, cyber and electronic and orbital and digital, all these different areas. And so what we did is we ended up creating these teams, but I had to kind of create this team of teams approach. So I had everybody read this book, and then we created this model where we had, Gemba walks and Gemba boards so we can go around and see what everybody's doing. And we had, stand-ups and OKRs and a lot of lessons learned out of team of teams. So great book. The other kind of cool story about Team of Teams is General McChrystal told all of his special operators to take one guy off the team and put him somewhere else. And so he was worried that they were going to take their worst person off the team. But they did the opposite. They actually took their best person because they wanted to represent the best of the best. And so they would send, one of their guys to the NSA, or another team member would go to the CIA, or another guy would go to the Pentagon to staff on the Hill, right? But then what happened was, over the next couple of years, because that ecosystem spread out and now they had their people inside all these other organizations, they were able to navigate the bureaucracy, build those relationships, those partnerships. So when that team or that organization needed help, they had somebody already in the inside. So that's another good technique that we could do in the military, is move our people around and keep that collaboration going. The next book I want to talk about is Kill Chain by Christian Brozzi. One of my favorite books. Might be, actually, if you don't read anything, read this book. And it really just talks about how we have to really transform the way that we're thinking about funding programs in the military. So thinking about the platform. So instead of the $10-12 billion Virginia class submarine, maybe we think about the Orca subs from Boeing, the drone subs, or the pizza box satellites instead of the big $500 million satellites, right? Or the F-35. Maybe we start making drone aircraft as well. So we have to think about, investing in our networks and interconnected, so we can have like more drone capability, and less expensive platforms that are more recyclable, reusable, and don't cost us a lot. And then the last two I'll just talk about China. So if you're really thinking about, like, you want to learn a little bit more about China and what their ambitions are, there's the 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury. Mr. Pillsbury was at the agency. He was a CIA advisor under Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George W. Bush, Clinton, and I think all the way to I think GW, or even into the Obama administration. So he covered a massive amount of time over the years advising several administrations. And the story really goes into what's China's goals and ambitions are. And it starts, the 100-Year Marathon starts in 1949 when Mao came into power, and really kind of lays out what happened from 1949 all the way until today, and where does China see themselves by 2049 to become the world's superpower, not just militarily, economically, environmentally, and in every possible way. And it really helps us kind of think about the mindset. There, Gordon Chang has some great books too, if you can read some of his stuff, but talks about, China really thinks that they're the center of the universe. So where we think we're, the Earth, and we got the China and Russia and the U.S., like we're all on this Earth. Really, China's mindset is they are the center of the universe, and that goes back into some of the, things that they're kind of angry at the United States about from way back in the 19th century, from some U.S. presidents that, they're not too happy with what we did with them. So they're playing the long game. They've got a big vision, and we got to have our vision as well. And the last book I'll just close on is called Danger Zone: The Coming Conflict with China by Professor Hal Brands. Great guy. He actually joined the book club with me last year, talking about his book. But he's a professor on Chinese military. And so he really talks about, like, if we, God forbid, do have a conflict, what that might look like. Leading up to it, what the conflict would look like, and then what would happen afterwards. So it's if you want to read a book that might keep you up at night and maybe you need a little bit of motivation to get to work every day, that would probably be the book to read. So anyways, those are my top books. We'll kind of dive into each one of these, and I hope to have a couple of sessions with some of the authors of these books in the future. So appreciate your time, and signing off here on Digital Frontlines. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere where you get your podcasts.